what we're meant to think about this story is to try to, first of all, see the depths of human sin. That's one of the lenses that the Bible wants us to understand, is what happens when you run away from God. And then much of the rest of the Bible, like all of the prophets, are then the call back from that brink to come back to God. But also to see God's grace and providence even in the midst of that darkness. And so that's what we're going to look at. I have a few questions we're going to talk about as well as we get into this section. But let's pray first, and then we'll dive in. God, thank you for your word. Thank you even for these stories that don't really make it into the children's Bible. But still, you have something to tell us, and we are called to think about you even in dark times. And it's encouraging to know that you are there and still calling us to follow you, even when the culture around us, even what's supposed to be the Christian culture around us, is unfaithful and uninterested in following you, that you still have a call for us to obey you in the midst of the good times or the bad times. So let us grow closer to Christ this week as we meditate on this text and then on the end of Philippians 4 as well later. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so rather than reading all of, turn to Judges chapter 20. Rather than reading all of it, I'm going to summarize a little bit. Then we'll jump into what's going on. So, from Judges 19, you have this Levite who travels from Bethlehem. And he goes down into some of the hill country in Judah, near where the Ephraimites are. And he travels, first of all, up to Bethlehem to get this concubine who's run away from him. And he takes her. His father delays him for a couple of days. Finally, he decides to leave towards evening time. And they're needing to find somewhere to stay the night. And when they decide not to go into one of the Philistine cities, Jebus, near where Jerusalem was, and instead they go to one of the Israelite cities, Gibeah. And when they get into Gibeah, they're standing in the town square hoping for someone to invite them in. They didn't have hotels, so they were just reliant on hospitality. And so finally this older man comes in from the field after working all day, and he sees them and says, "You guys can't stay in the square, it's not safe." So invites them into their house, but then the men of the city come wanting to have bad relations with him. It's parallel to the Sodom and Gomorrah story. And the older man says, "Well, I have my virgin daughter and this concubine, so take them instead." This is a really, really nasty, bad story. That they take these girls, and at the end of the night, after being totally abused, the concubine is left at the doorstep, and she's crawling to the threshold and just lies down on the threshold. We don't know whether she's dead or alive at that point. The Levite, who's supposed to be this religious ruler of Israel, comes, kind of prods her with his foot, says, "Get up, let's go." No care, no empathy, no sense of remorse for his part in what's happened. And apparently she's dead, or we're not even told. The narrator is very unclear, but he cuts her up into 12 pieces and sends her across Israel as a sign of the awfulness of what's happened in Gibeah. And this is where we pick up for the second half of the story. So that was last week. Go back and listen to the recording if you want to think through that first half more clearly. But now we get to Israel's reaction, and they are justifiably furious at the Gibeonites, and by extension at the Benjamites, who we're going to find out. So Gibeah is one of the towns of Benjamin, and the rest of Benjamin actually defends Gibeah and its actions. So jumping into the beginning of chapter 20, all the people of Israel are coming out from Dan to Beersheba, so from the north to the south, including the land of Gilead, and the congregation assembled as one man to the Lord at Mizpah. So all the people are getting together, 400,000 men on foot that drew the sword. They're coming together to ask God about what to do about these Benjamites who have done such an awful deed. So verse 4, the Levite comes out, he's the husband of the concubine, he's going to explain what happened. And his story is a little bit slanted. He says, I came to Gibeah that belongs to Benjamin, and my concubine and I to spend the night. And the leaders of Gibeah rose against me and surrounded the house against me by night. They meant to kill me, and they violated my concubine. He kind of leaves out the little detail of the fact that he sent her out the door as this pawn to protect himself. And she is dead. So I took hold of my concubine and cut her in pieces and sent her throughout all the country of the inheritance of Israel, for they have committed abomination and outrage in Israel. Behold, you people of Israel, all of you, give your advice and counsel here. And the people arose as one man, saying, none of us will go to his tent, and none of us will return to his house. But now this is what we will do to Gibeah. We will go up against it by lot. And we will take 10 men of 100 throughout all the tribes of Israel, and 100 of 1,000, and 1,000 of 10,000. So a tenth of all the people they're going to take to bring provisions for the people. Then when they come, they may repay Gibeah Benjamin for all the outrage that they have committed in Israel. So the Israelites gather. They send some emissaries to Benjamin, to Gibeah. They say, what is this evil that has taken place among you? Now therefore, give up the men, the worthless fellows of Gibeah, that we may put them to death and purge evil from Israel. They're trying to follow the Mosaic law, which dictated that the murderers should be put to death, and sexual offenders should be put to death. And so they're taking a quite reasonable action to say, give us the people who committed this crime, and we need to kill them before God in order to take this evil out of the land so that we're not being polluted. And they're not continuing as a bad example in this really, really awful act. But here's where the story gets interesting, because Benjamin as a tribe, they wouldn't listen to the voice of their brothers, the people of Israel. This is in verse 13. Then the people of Benjamin came together out of the cities of Gibeah to go out to battle against the people of Israel. So rather than sending in these criminals to be put to death as the justice of the Mosaic law demanded, they're actually defending them. The whole tribe of Benjamin is defending them. And the people of Benjamin mustered out of their cities on that day 26,000 men who drew the sword, besides the inhabitants of Gibeah, who mustered 700 chosen men. So notice the discrepancy. Gibeah, 700 men. The whole tribe of Benjamin has 26,000 men. And so this whole tribe is going to come together and defend Gibeah. So Israel, here's their response. They're going to inquire of God at Bethel, which is one of the main, before the temple was built. This is during the time of the Judges, actually quite early, which we'll find out in a little bit, that they're gathering at Bethel to ask God what they should do. So they went up to Bethel and inquired of God, verse 18, who shall go up first for us to fight against the people of Benjamin? And the Lord said, Judah shall go up first. Now, this is one of the interesting questions in this chapter, in these couple chapters, which we're going to get to today, is what is God's relationship to this? Like, they're inquiring of God, and God is kind of giving vague, he's giving answers, but he's not giving really theological answers. He's not saying this is why you should act in a certain way. He's rather just endorsing certain lines of actions in a sense. It's kind of odd, God's participation in this story, and we'll notice this again. So, verse 19, then the people of Israel rose in the morning, they encamped against Gibeah, and the men of Israel went out to fight against Benjamin. And what we see over the next several verses is they're actually defeated a couple of times. Israel is defeated by Benjamin. Notice 400,000 men of Israel, 25,000 men of Benjamin, and they're defeated. And so they're defeated. And verse 23, and the people of Israel went up and wept before the Lord until evening, and they inquired of the Lord, shall we again draw near to fight against our brothers, the people of Benjamin? And the Lord said, go up against them. The people of Israel came near to the people of Benjamin the second day. So they fought first day, they're defeated. Benjamin went up against them out of Gibeah the second day and destroyed 18,000 men of the children of Israel. So they're defeated a second time here. So the first time, verse 21, there 22,000 men are destroyed of Israel. Second time, 18,000 men are destroyed of Israel. So they've already lost 40,000 men, 2 defeats against Benjamin. All these were men who drew the sword. So then again in verse 26, the people of Israel, the whole army, they go up, they're weeping before God, wondering, we've been defeated twice. Isn't this a righteous cause, God? Why are you letting us be defeated by these people who are protecting criminals who are doing things that are very much against your law? They sat there before the Lord, this is the middle of verse 26, and fasted that day until evening and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. So they're trying to do the proper ritual approach to God. And the people of Israel inquired of the Lord, for the ark of the covenant of God was there in those days. And Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, and here's where we're going to be able to date this passage. I'll note this again in a second. So Phinehas, this is the same Phinehas who, when in Numbers 25, there's this outbreak of plague because of some rebellion in the wilderness. As a young man, so this is the story of Balaam. Phinehas, as a young man, remember, so here we're at the end of Judges. Back in the wilderness wandering years, during the 40 years in the wilderness, Phinehas, same guy, as a young man, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, Balaam comes and he is unable to curse Israel, and so he convinces this pagan tribe to cause Israel to be led into sexual immorality. And so Israel starts flirting with the pagan women and causes all kinds of trouble. And Phinehas actually stops the plague of God, because God gets so mad against Israel and its debauchery and its just complete throwing out all of the commands of God. Is Israel supposed to be this pure people? Phinehas comes in and he actually spears an Israelite man and pagan woman who are doing bad things. And it's this moment where God blesses Phinehas. So same guy now, presumably 40 to 60 years later. We'll talk about the chronology of all of this in a bit. But this Phinehas is the same guy in Numbers. So Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, he ministered before the Lord in those days. He's the high priest in the Aaronic line. So he's saying, middle of verse 28, shall we go out once more to battle against our brothers? This is the third time they're going to go out. They've been defeated the 2 previous times. Against our brothers, the people of Benjamin, or shall we cease? And the Lord said, go up, for tomorrow I will give them into your hand. So Israel sent men in ambush around Gibeah. And the people of Israel went up against the people of Benjamin on the third day and set themselves in array against Gibeah as at other times. And the people of Benjamin went out against the people and were drawn away from the city. And as at other times, they began to strike and kill some of the people in the highways, one of which goes up to Bethel and the other to Gibeah, and in the open country, about 30 men of Israel. And the people of Benjamin said, they are routed before us as at first. So basically what's happening, Gibeah, so Israel sets a bunch of their men in ambush, and the men of Gibeah are coming out of the city. The Israelites come to attack them and then flee, drawing the Gibeonites out of the city. Similar tactic to what happened at Ai when Joshua is coming in with the Israelites just a few years earlier in the timeline. They're coming out of the city, and then all the men in ambush come back behind the Gibeonites and put the city to torch. That's kind of the rest of this chapter. And the Gibeonites are destroyed. They turn around and they see smoke coming up from their city. The Israelites, who they thought were fleeing like they had the couple times before, now turn around in shock and terror and see that now they've been surrounded by Israelites and they're cut down. So the men of Israel turned against the city. The city is going up in smoke to heaven. They turned. The men of Benjamin are dismayed. They saw disaster was close upon them. You kind of get this slightly poetic explanation of how the battle is going. So you get the summary in verse 46 of chapter 20. So all who fell that day of Benjamin were 25,000 men who drew the sword, all of them men of valor. But 600 men turned and fled towards the wilderness to the rock of Rimmon and remained at the rock of Rimmon 4 months. The men of Israel turned back against the people of Benjamin and struck them with the edge of the sword, the city, men and beasts, and all that they found. And all the towns that they found, they set on fire. Now the men of Israel had sworn at Mizpah. So here we get this transition into chapter 21. The battle is done, and now we're going to find out the outcome for these 600 men of the battle. They'd sworn at Mizpah, no one of us shall give his daughter in marriage to Benjamin. And the people came to Bethel and sat there till evening before God. And they lifted up their voices and wept bitterly. And they said, O Lord, God, the God of Israel, why has this happened in Israel, that today there should be one tribe lacking in Israel? The next day the people rose early and built there an altar and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. The people of Israel said, which of all the tribes of Israel did not come up in the assembly to the Lord? For they had taken a great oath concerning him who did not come up to the Lord at Mizpah, saying, he shall surely be put to death. And the people of Israel had compassion for Benjamin their brother, and said, one tribe is cut off from Israel this day. What shall we do for wives for those who are left, since they have sworn by the Lord that we will not give them any of our daughters for wives? So Israel, originally 12 tribes, now Benjamin is down to only 600 men. They've killed everybody else. This is part of this war against impurity. And now they're trying to figure out calling to God, but we'll get to the complexity of all of this. That they're not really asking the right questions of God. They're just like, God, help us do what we want to do. And we'll see that as we go forward. But now they're saying, we don't want to have Benjamin just completely erased from the Israelite heritage. We want to somehow preserve this remnant of 600 guys, even though these guys still help defend all the wickedness that happened in chapter 19. So they're going to try to come up with a plan. Actually, they come up with 2 different plans. So they realize that there's these people from Jabesh Gilead who didn't come up to fight. And so they decide that because of this, they have a blank check to go steal girls from this tribe, destroy, or not tribe, but this part of the tribe, destroy part of Jabesh Gilead, and then steal all of their young girls to come be wives. It sounds like a great plan, right? This is not good things happening here. Like, God is not endorsing any of this story, just for the record, but we're going to get to this. So they're like, yeah, this sounds great. Let's go do it. So the congregation, this is verse 10 of chapter 21, they sent 12,000 of their bravest men there and commanded them, go and strike the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead with the edge of the sword, also the women and the little ones. This is what you shall do. Every male and every woman that has lain with male, you shall devote to destruction. And they found among the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead 400 young virgins who had not known a man by lying with him. And they brought them to the camp at Shiloh, which is in the land of Canaan. Then the whole congregation sent word to the people of Benjamin, who were at the rock of Rimmon, and proclaimed peace to them. Sounds so nice. And Benjamin returned at that time, and they gave them the women whom they had saved alive from the women of Jabesh Gilead. But there were not enough for them. Yeah, the narration here is intentionally very kind of curt and quite disturbing, the way it's presented. So you're meant to note the dissonance between what your comfort level should be as a Christian, but even as a Jew steeped in the Mosaic law, versus what's going on here. So you should be uncomfortable with this story. You shouldn't be like, yeah, that makes sense. That your feeling of this is really weird and wrong. That's okay. This is a normal way to read this text, and I'll explain why in a little bit. So they take these 400 virgins, they give them to the 600 guys, but there's only 400, and 400 doesn't equal 600, so they need 200 more. So now they need plan 2 to figure out where 200 more girls are going to come from. So verse 16, then the elders of the congregation get together. Okay, we need plan B. What shall we do for wives for those who are left, since the women are destroyed out of Benjamin? And they said, there must be an inheritance for the survivors of Benjamin, that a tribe not be blotted out from Israel. Yet we cannot give them wives from our own daughters, for the people of Israel have sworn, cursed be he who gives a wife to Benjamin. So they said, oh yeah, this plan makes even better sense. No. Behold, verse 19, behold, there is a yearly feast to the Lord. That's a great place to go steal girls from. A feast to the Lord at Shiloh, which is north of Bethel, on the east of the highway that goes up from Bethel to Shechem and south to Lebonah. And they commanded the people of Benjamin, saying, go and lie in ambush in the vineyards. And watch, if the daughters of Shiloh come out to dance in the dances, then come out of the vineyards and snatch each man his wife from the daughters of Shiloh, and go to the land of Benjamin. And when their fathers or brothers come to complain to us, and we will say to them, grant them graciously to us, because we did not take for each man the wife in battle, neither did you give them to them, or else you should now be guilty. So these Israelites, they're saying, you won't technically be breaking the covenant you made because you didn't give them willingly. They got taken. Like, what? Their logic here is really problematic. Verse 23, and the people of Benjamin did so and took their wives according to their number from the dancers whom they carried off. And they went and returned to the inheritance and rebuilt the towns and lived in them. And the people of Israel departed from there at that time, every man to his tribe and family, and they went out from there, every man to his inheritance. And here, in the last verse of Judges, is this key phrase that hopefully you recognize from back at the beginning of chapter 19, and then in chapter 17 and 18 as well. In those days, there was no king in Israel. And this is really the theological lens that we need to interpret all of the last 5 chapters through, 17 through 21. That this is how God is looking at it. There was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And then the next book of the Hebrew Bible, not our Bible, because we get Ruth next, but in the Hebrew Old Testament, the next book is 1 Samuel and the story of the kings. Saul, kind of a problem king, and then David and the Davidic covenant, and there's a theological thread that's running through this story that's very intentional in how it was written. So, okay, first of all, before we dive into a couple of questions, a note on chronology. So there's this weird story. Why is this story here? Like anytime you approach a biblical text, but particularly a more obscure one like this, like it's easy. It's something like you take Galatians 5, right? The fruits of the Spirit. Like, you know, as Christians, just have these fruits: love, joy, peace, patience, goodness, kindness. Like, you're like, yeah, God, good. Yes, okay, makes sense. Story like this, less so. You're like, why did I need to know this? This is an obscure story, a terrifying story. And God has given it to us for a reason. So we need to think about, why did God preserved this story for us over 4,000 years, well, 3,000, maybe 300 years or so of time. Why did God give us this story for us to still think about here in the 21st century? Okay, to answer that question, we need to think through a little bit of chronology. Notice that this story talks about Phineas still being alive. What that tells us is that this story actually happened probably before most of the other events of the book of Judges. So even though, so this is an important note about Old Testament books. They're not necessarily written chronologically. Like a history book typically nowadays would be written where the first event happens and it's written in a chronological order. Not so the book of Judges. The book of Judges is written in a theological order, which means that it's written with specific spirals of events happening to prove a point. And the point here is that these are the worst of the events that are happening. This is the bottom of the spiral where people have totally forsaken God. They're, if anything, they're abusing God. They're using God as kind of a puppet to try to attain their own ends. And so you have all of this carnage and just root rot in Israel that's happened because they're not really paying attention to God anymore. But notice, this probably happens within the first generation of Joshua having died. Remember at the beginning of the book of Judges, Judges chapter 2, it talks about Joshua dies, he's been faithful, but then this first generation now is not faithful anymore. Well, because Phineas is still alive, he's an old man, it's within 60 years or so of the events in the wilderness. Therefore, this story is not just put here as a chronological end piece. It's actually making a point to say, even regardless of where in the timeline you're at, this is the bottom of the bucket. This is the worst of the people rebelling against God. So this story, we're meant to interpret it in terms of there's no king in Israel, people have abandoned God, and here's what happens. You have carnage for the Israelites, 40,000 people at least are killed. You have carnage for the Benjamites, 25,000 are killed. Just total death and mayhem happening because of the refusal to listen to God. And this is where the story goes. So in the last bit of the Sunday school, I want to try to answer a couple questions, or as a group for us to think through a couple questions. One is, this story paints a dark picture about women and how Israel treats women. And remember, maybe I should preface this by something that we're going to get to in a bit. Something that hopefully you're taking away from the book of Judges is that so the way it was explained to me in seminary is it's called narrative is not normative. But what that means is what's happening in these stories, it is not meant to just be applied across the board. So this story is a particularly clear example of that, but there's other stories. Just because something happens in a New Testament or Old Testament story does not mean God is therefore saying, go and do likewise. Hopefully that's really clear in this story. Either from the Levites side of the story or the Israelites, how they respond, the Benjamites, how they respond, there's not really a clear hero in this story. In a sense, God is the hero. I mean, God is always the hero, but God is not that active in this particular moment. And his absence is probably the most striking part of this story. But there's really no part of this story that we're supposed to emulate, except in a negative sense, where you might say, do the opposite of what they're doing here. So just because something is portrayed or lived out in a story in the Bible does not mean we're supposed to live it out. We have to think through the story and understand, is this something God is calling us to follow or not? So that's point one. But given that within this story, very negative portrayal towards women, just being abused horribly. So the question being, how does God view women in the Old Testament? How are we to think about this not just this story, but more broadly, an Old Testament portrayal of women? What do you guys think about that? Yeah, mad at both Adam and Eve. Yeah, do you want to explain that a little bit more, Claudia?
Well, I guess my thought is that he was the one who took the apple.
Yeah.
He was the one who took the apple, and even though God knew all this was going to happen, I still think that it hurt. He was disappointed. And maybe not. I've heard Tyler say before that you can't disappoint God because he knows what's going to happen. But
Yeah.
I still think there's some little hurt in there somewhere along the line. And I don't know. I hate to think that God would take his wrath out on all women all the way down through the ages, but sometimes it looks that way from my point of view, from a woman's point of view.
Yeah.
So I think he's just still upset.
Yeah. Londa.
Well, I'm thinking that because God wants Israel to be the theocracy as the king, and it's really showing that.
Yeah.
I need to talk into that. They can't hear me. They can't on the Zoom. They can't hear you. It's supposed to be a theocracy with God as the king. And we're shown a picture of what happens when they don't have their king.
Yes.
See, no, I lost my train of thought getting up here. Because when we actually see God, like you were saying, he's not really present in this story. It's kind of showing you the lack of his presence as king. They're not paying attention, and he's, kind of letting them see how this goes, in a sense. But when you see him actually active, you see him gentle and caring himself for the women, the way he looks after them and things. So that's my thought on that.
That brings up a lot of very helpful points. So when there's no king in Israel, what's interesting is when you get into 1 Samuel, Eli's sons are rotters. Eli is this priest who's in the line of Aaron. His sons are completely profaning God's presence. And the people say, give us a king. And Eli is frustrated at that. And God says, give them a king because it's not me that they're rebelling against here. It's not you that they're rebelling against here. It's me. And so even though, yes, you have there was no king in Israel certainly points to Saul and David and Solomon and the kings, but even more so, it points to the fact that the people aren't worshiping God as king. So your point, Londa, is very helpful. Another interesting note here on the kings. What tribe is Saul from? Benjamin, exactly. So you wonder when this account is written, like when is Judges written? Depending on when it's written, you can see the connection, right? Whether it's written during Saul's time or perhaps during David's time as a bit of a propaganda piece against Saul. Saul's coming from this bad heritage. Yes, Claudia. Oh, go for it.
So I'm curious again, what was said and where did I go wrong?
Oh, no, you're not wrong. She was adding an additional nuance regarding the king and the kings in the background to the story. But you're right to say, so I would maybe caveat things slightly differently. God is clearly, so there are curses against both Adam and Eve. Right. God says, on the day you eat of the fruit, you will die. And that is something that is put to both Adam Adam and Eve particularly in childbearing, Adam more in working, but they're both going to die. And in this story, one of the things that I think is interesting or helpful to note is there's a lot of women who are used wrongly. First of all, of course, the concubine primarily, and then all of the 600 women that are taken to be wives to Benjamin. But you also have 65,000 men dying in war. Some for Benjamin, some for Israel. That both men and women in this story and other places in the Old Testament too are dying as a result of their sin, and even as a result of other people's sin. The Israelites are seeking to be righteous in a warped, imperfect sense, but they're dying as a result of this Levite and the men of Gibeah.
So then I guess I'm missing your point in the whole thing. If we're not talking about the damage that's done to women, okay, as a whole.
Yeah.
And then you bring up all the men that were killed and were cursed as all of this, then I missed the point.
No, you're not missing the point.
Well, when you think about what God thinks about women, the best place to go to is in Genesis 1 and 2 before everything went wrong. Mm-hmm. There we have God clearly valuing both men and women. They're supposed to be in a complementary, loving relationship where no one's fighting the other person. So that's God's ideal. That's what God thinks about women and men. And then as soon as Genesis 3 happens and the fall happens, then you have in Genesis 3:16 where God says that men and women are going to be at odds with one another from here on out. The marriage relationship is going to be full of tension, where men and women are both trying to take advantage of the other, and now there's tension. There's a tendency toward men to domineering and all sorts of other things, and so all of the things that you see happen to. All the things that you see in Judges where the women are enslaved, the women are oppressed, the women are treated like sex objects, the women are nothing, they're just property. That's not God's heart.
Right.
That's people showing how messed up the world has become. God's heart for men and women is in Genesis 1 and 2, and all of that's going to be fixed in the end. So God values men and women. And you see that in Genesis 1 and 2. And even today, you still see, this isn't just a Judges thing, you still see our society still has this, Western society, for example, they still have this obsession with devaluing women. The number one song in America right now is a song that's so filthy and horrid. I can't even say the title because the title itself, do any younger people know what the number one song in America is right now? Okay, good. Well, if you have the nerve, go on your phone and look it up after the service. And then if the title itself doesn't make you frightened, then read the lyrics. It is the most vile and disgusting song celebrating sexual debauchery. It's written by two women, performed by two women, and it is the most vile thing. And it's the number one song in America, and it has been for several weeks. And all it does is objectify and glorify sex with multiple partners in a triumphant way with the crudest, sickest language. So that kind of thing, it's not just men domineering women. Of course, that's happened, certainly. It's also women degrading themselves. It's men not acting like men either. It's all of us failing to be the kind of people that God made us to be as men and women. It's all screwed up. It's all messed up. And it's all because of Genesis 3. Right. So if you want to know what God thinks about men and women, you look at Genesis 1 and 2, and you'll see his heart, and then you see the chaos afterward. Sorry, Monty, you've been waiting.
Oh, that's okay. I just wanted to say the last verse in 21 says it all.
Exactly.
They did what was right in their own eyes,
Right.
not God's eyes.
Yeah.
But man's eyes. And when we get off focus from what God expects and what God sees us as, it becomes very evil.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you can look at a book like the Song of Solomon as another example of what God wants the relationships between men and women to be. My point in bringing this up specifically is to say this text and many others in the Old Testament, Abraham and Hagar, for example, is not God's picture of what relationships between, like, don't misread this as God approving it just because it's in the Bible. Understand, this is man and woman in rebellion against God and the consequences of it. And so, yeah, go to Genesis 1 and 2, go to the Song of Solomon, et cetera, as a picture of here's what God wants us to be. And so as we look at this and are frightened by it, rightly so, or as we look at our culture and are frightened by it, this is men and women standing against God. And this is what God is calling us out of into a right relationship. And so you go somewhere like Ephesians 5 to a picture of Christ wants men and women to treat each other properly in a marriage relationship, to love each other rightly in a covenant relationship, so that things like this don't happen. And that's precisely the point of this chapter. If they had God as their king, this never would have happened. They wouldn't have been in this mess. Other thoughts or comments on that?
Yeah, I just think the purposeful lack of like God's intervention in the story just basically points out what you were saying. The narrative isn't normative. It's
Right.
just because this happened, it wasn't God's view. I mean, if you want to see God's view, you also can look at like Esther and
Yes.
Ruth and Mary.
Right.
And how he took care of and provided for them. So I think it's pretty clear that this isn't what he thinks.
Yes.
It's hard actually to draw conclusions about what he thinks about women from these two chapters because he's not in them.
Right. And that's the thing, is trying to make sure that we're not accidentally absorbing a wrong view of men or women from this chapter. I appreciate that you particularly brought up the book of Ruth, because really, I think one of the most significant studies that you can do about Judges is contrast Judges and Ruth, because Ruth is happening historically in the timeline of Judges.
Yeah,
And
what
so-
does Boaz think about women?
Right.
You know?
Right.
It's a bit of a difference.
And exactly. And so it's actually a helpful note for us, or a helpful study for us. We live in a time, like Tyler mentioned, where there is abysmal degeneration, cultural degeneration, particularly in our area here in Olympia. People don't pretend to be Christian. They don't pretend to have Christian ethics. And we are called to be faithful to God in the midst of that, in the midst of a culture that has completely rotted and gone in terrible direction. And Ruth and Boaz are rooted in that same kind of culture. Ruth and Boaz are growing up in the midst of the book of Judges. They're growing up with these jokers who are supposed to be leaders of Israel, who are doing all kinds of heinous things that are against God's law. And yet they are able to follow God in the midst of that. And so as we think about what's our responsibility in the world, in a world where the culture is not Christian at all, not righteous or just at all, we can model ourselves after Ruth and Boaz and their faithfulness, and through their line. And this is perhaps one of the it's the most significant thread throughout the whole Old Testament. And it's why you have Genesis 3:15. God says, the seed of the woman, this is the promise, right? There's curses against Adam and Eve, but the promise is, Eve, your seed will crush this serpent, and it'll bite his heel, but he will have victory. And of course, that's Christ on the cross. But that seed goes all the way through the remnant here. Ruth has a grandchild named David, and David has a seed named Jesus. That's why, notice most of the Gospels, they start with the genealogy, not John, but like Matthew, starts with a big long genealogy, and you're wondering why all these names? Well, it's tracing back Jesus through Old Testament history. And Ruth is part of that list. And so even though in a culture just completely run amok, you still have God's faithfulness. And that's really found in the book of Ruth. And then the 1 Samuel, where you get to David. And that's God's answer to all of this evilness that we're seeing in these chapters particularly. But even the evilness in our own world, in our own moment in history, God's answer is the righteous people who are following Jesus, and Jesus and his final victory, which is Revelation 19.
You have any thoughts, Tim? You've been quiet.
Really quiet now.
Were you talking to me, Tyler?
Yes.
Well, just my thoughts were this is kind of a comparison to what's going on in our country right now. We don't respect the law. We don't respect our people that make the law. And we're deteriorating just like the Israelis did. I think when the Israelis got beat by the Benjaminites, that it's just a consequence that there was sin on both sides of the line, and so that there was judgment going on, and quite often nobody really sought after God until they got into trouble. And in this case, they really didn't seek after God of what to do, because technically Benjamin probably would have, if they were seeking after God, would have taken care of the situation themselves.
Yes, right. Well, or even they had the chance just to turn the men of Gibeon. Think how many lives would have been saved, men and women, if they just turned the actual culprits over at the beginning of the story, rather than going to war to defend these evil people. Yeah, Benjamin totally makes the wrong choice early on.
And I do think Tim makes a really good point about how our country in America is really not much better. And I do, I really hesitated to bring up that song, but it's a perfect representation of how awful, how our society has no moral foundation left. I mean, you read about when my mom was a kid, all this talk about how rock and roll is going to ruin kids' lives and everything, and you hear the Elvis and his hip gyrations, and you have Led Zeppelin and all this other stuff in the late 60s, and it's all so horrible. Those lyrics can't touch anything that this song glorifies. I mean, it's something that's, you read it and you just think, oh my goodness, it's the worst thing ever. But that's what our culture, that's where our culture is.
Yeah.
So it really is a parallel time. What's that?
Hindsight's always 20/20, I think. And looking back, because my parents, same thing. I can remember when the Beatles came on the Ed Sullivan Show, and I thought my mom was going to have a heart attack. It was, because when you think about the culture, the musical history, it did go in that direction, and it led. I mean, one thing led to the next, to the next, to the next, until we're at a song like you said, in this whole freedom of speech and stuff like that. I don't want to get into all that, but it's still the same thing is that, I don't know, I go back to "You Are My Sunshine," that type of thing. I'd much rather have that.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's only a symptom of a disbelief in God and idolizing other things aside from God. So we can spend all day complaining about problems in the culture, and some things, yeah, we legitimately have to be warned against. But the bigger issue is we have to show people, rather than just saying, oh, our culture is so vile, I wish I lived 100 years ago or whatever. Rather, we need to point our culture to what is true and good and beautiful about Christ. That's the answer for us. We can't just retreat into our shells and point fingers back at the culture, but rather point to Christ. That's what we're called to as Christians. I do want to switch gears here just for a second in our last couple minutes, just to read through, because the big point here, there's parallels to our culture for sure. One of the big points that I think is really important from this story as becoming better readers of the Bible is to understand, how do we read stories like this? Aside from whether it's this story or whether it's some other story in the Old Testament, particularly the Old Testament, but this applies to the New Testament as well. How do we read stories like this? How do we understand what's going on? I want to give some recommendation. Well, I want to propose some thoughts on how to read stories like this, and I can give you them in print if you want, but here's a few thoughts. So an Old Testament story like this, it doesn't directly teach a doctrine. So it's not like, say, Paul in Romans 6, where he's directly teaching a doctrine about sanctification. This is different. Secondly, an Old Testament narrative usually illustrates a doctrine. So we could talk about what's the doctrine that's being illustrated here. Well, here's what happens when people completely reject God and his laws. That's what's being illustrated. So you go back to Deuteronomy 28, for example, all the curses. Narratives record what happens. This is really key for this particular story. Narratives record what happened, not necessarily what should have happened or what ought to happen every time. What actually happened, not what should have happened. Therefore, not every narrative has an individual identifiable moral of the story. It's too easy for us to try to pull morals out of the story. Not every Old Testament story has a moral. Now, it does point back to Old Testament doctrines or biblical doctrine, but there's not necessarily a clear moral here. What people do in narratives is not necessarily a good example for us. In fact, it's usually the opposite. You can see that here. It's not saying this is what we should do. In fact, oftentimes it's just the opposite. This is what we shouldn't do. This is how people rebelled against God. Most of the characters in the Old Testament are far from perfect. Even characters like David and Abraham and Moses have flaws. So they're far from perfect, and their actions are too. They make bad choices, and we see that here. We are not always told at the end of the narrative whether what happened was good or bad. Can you see that in this story? Now here we are actually told this was bad. This was just unadulterated evil. We should be able to judge whether what happened is good or bad from what God has taught us elsewhere categorically in the scriptures. So this is part of why it's important to be familiar with the law in Deuteronomy or some of God's kind of founding explanations about the world and what's true in the world in Genesis 1 through 11. Or the prophets help us interpret what's good and bad in Israelite society. The narratives like this story, not so much. So you have to be familiar with those other sections of scripture in order to understand whether what's happening in this story is good or bad.